What's up, everybody? Welcome back to class. All right, today I have a very important lecture for you, and this is probably one of my more favorite lectures that I hit over the year because I'm going to be talking about two really interesting guys. You may have noticed throughout the year, I do try to do some profiles like the Teddy Roosevelt, the Jack Johnson ones. I really like, and I think it's easier to understand history when you get those personal interest stories and you look at an actual human's experience and try to put yourself in their shoes or in somebody that was close around them and try to, understand history through their perspective and the vantage point that they're seeing things. So the two guys that I'm hitting today are Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, two civil rights leaders. Probably both of them go down as two of the biggest, if not the biggest names of like people in leadership roles during the civil rights movement. And they also have very different styles and are just very different life stories and life narratives. Okay. Without a doubt, Martin Luther King Jr. is the most well-known one. I mean, heck, most cities and towns in America have like a street named after him. He has monuments all over. He definitely, without a doubt, had the biggest following. Now, does that mean he was the best one or had all of the perfect strategies? I don't know. That's pretty subjective. And honestly, me picking these two guys, I do want you to understand that there's dozens of big civil rights leaders and impactful characters that are well known and are definitely worthy of studying. Now, in this class, I'm running behind a little bit, so I don't have time to get into a bunch of different stories, but I definitely wanted to hit these two guys. It was top priority for me to at least get these two in, and I like them because they are both big names that had big followings and definitely impacted America, and because they definitely contrast each other in very stark contrast in just their ideology, style, religion, and backgrounds. So I think I like hitting these two guys specifically because they're both looking at America back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. They're both experiencing the same kind of like segregation and discrimination. They both spent time down in the segregated South and whatnot, and saw all of the injustices. And it kind of, I think when you look at both of their stories, it gives you some insight into there's not one right way to go about protesting or trying to get change. There's different ways of doing it. There's multiple paths. And then the Q&A that I'm going to assign to this one today, I want you to be thinking as you're going through this lecture, if you had been a young black kid back in this era, which one of these guys would have appealed to you more? If you had been like a middle-aged white person back in the 1950s or 60s, which of these guys would have maybe appealed to you a little bit more? Would you have been more open to? And then also think about if you are a student in history, which you are today, and you're looking back on it, which of these guys do you think had kind of a better style, and which one appeals to you more today looking back on it in history? Okay, so be thinking about those things as we go through it. And then which one do you think was more successful and had a better strategy that made more of an impact? So those are a few questions I want you to think about as we're going through and doing this lecture. All right, here we go. Starting off with Martin Luther King. Obviously, he's the giant of the civil rights movement, a larger than life character, and he has a profound impact. I think without a doubt, Martin Luther King is the one that is the most well known and had the biggest following. And then, in my opinion, and granted, this is a very subjective thing, like those questions I just asked you, there is no real right or wrong answer to them. It's a subjective kind of biased opinion. In the Chaluki opinion, I would say I think Martin Luther King clearly had the best strategy, although I totally get why Malcolm X would appeal to a different kind of cut of people in society. Anyway, Martin Luther King, he has a profound impact. That's why he's so well known today, because what he does and the protests he leads through the late 50s and most of the 1960s echo throughout history and have really changed American society. And he's actually able to get a lot of concrete policy changes, which we're not going to go over many of those today, but we will be in the near future. So my rundown for Martin Luther King Jr., I would want you, this stuff is all pretty good things for you to add into your notes. If you aren't taking notes, I would recommend that you start. This stuff obviously should be in your civil rights movement, that notes page. And I think both of these guys should have their own separate heading. So we had hit like Emmett Till, and then we had talked a little bit about Rosa Parks and the bus boycott. This would go in right behind that or right under that. So you have a Martin Luther King Jr. heading. Kind of his personal background. And I'm going to tell the story. You can just kind of sum it up in your notes so that you have a rough idea and some memory triggers there. Know that Martin Luther King Jr. had a pretty stable home life. He grew up, and I think what I know is I've heard is a very loving family. He had supportive parents that were together. He had a lot of support, good support system. He's highly educated. He ends up getting a bachelor's degree and then eventually a doctorate. So pretty good upbringing there that gives him a lot of solid social skills. He ends up developing into a great speaker and writer. Has that formal education. Then as a young man, he decides to become a Baptist minister. All right, and religion, I think, is seen a little bit differently today in modern America from how it would have been back a couple generations ago. But you got to remember, you go back, rewind the clock to the 1950s or 60s, most Americans are religious, or even if they're not, most Americans would have considered themselves Christian overwhelmingly. That's kind of the biggest religion. And in the civil rights movement, it seemed like a kind of a common thread for a lot of the leaders, many of which that we're not going to get to and cover, also had that religious background too. And that was kind of their base of operations, that they were a preacher first, and then they spread out into other walks of life and get into politics and stuff. But that religious background, having that core like church, many of them have that in common. So Martin Luther King Jr., Baptist minister, a key thing about him, and this is why I have it underlined and in bold, he was all about peaceful protest. He had looked at a guy named Mahatma Gandhi, or Mohandas Gandhi, but his nickname was Mahatma, which meant like the great soul. This guy, who we will not cover because he was in India and he was a little bit older than Martin Luther King Jr. He would have been alive when Martin Luther King was a kid. He basically had led the charge for India getting its independence from the British Empire. Well, Gandhi used all peaceful protest. He was adamant that there's no violence. We're not going to have riots. We're not going to kill the British. Doesn't matter what they do to us. We're always going to have peaceful protest, and it's going to be civil disobedience. That's another term that's kind of a bonus for you that I might make a quiz or test question, but I don't have it on the slide. So for those of you that are watching this, I would put that in your notes too. Civil disobedience, what that means is refusing to obey a law that is unjust, but you do it in a peaceful manner. Okay. So Martin Luther King looks at what Gandhi had done, kind of the generation before in India, and gets the Indian people their independence from Great Britain. And he says, that worked pretty darn good. And why not apply those same strategies and tactics here in America? So think, if you go back to this era, and these aren't exact stats, but I'm pretty close to the money here, about maybe 15% of the population in America was Black. Closer to like 80% or so was white. Now that has changed over time. We had a much smaller Latino and Asian population back then. And so the numbers have changed on into modern day. But back then you had about 15% of the country Black, roughly 80% or so is white. So even if Martin Luther King or these other civil rights leaders were able to mobilize the whole Black community and get them all on board and demanding the same changes, you're still a pretty small minority group. He knew that he would have to win not all white people, but he'd have to win over a decent chunk of white people and get them sympathetic to this cause in order to get good, meaningful like policy changes. And I think he was right when he decided that the best way to do that is through nonviolent protests, peaceful protests, because if people are out there, even if they're protesting something that is a legitimate like wrong or injustice, but they're out there burning buildings and looting and shooting police officers, when the average American is watching that on like the nightly news and they're seeing this or reading about it in the newspaper, that turns a lot of people off. So Martin Luther King was adamant from the very first protest he does, which is the Montgomery bus boycott, on through to everything that happens in the 1960s, that it had to be peaceful. Okay, very key thing about him. And he would tell people that were showing up at the meetings like ahead of the protest that, hey, if you can't be nonviolent, if you can't be peaceful, don't come. We appreciate your support, but don't come here, because he knew that just a few people that lose their cool can change all the optics and the whole dynamic of it. And his game plan is that he wants to be inclusive. He doesn't want his movement to be only black people out there marching. He wants to include as many sympathetic white people as he can too. Pretty smart cause. And he was able to do that and really appeal to a lot of like moderate white people. And if you go look back at a lot of the photos of his big marches and protests, often in many of them, you'll see a third of the people out in the crowd, sometimes even up to half, are white people that are out there marching too. Okay, that's going to be something that Malcolm X is quite different, and that tack that he takes. So some of the big protests, and we're going to hit a few of these when we get back from spring break in the near future. But the Montgomery bus boycott was the first one. That's the Rosa Parks incident where the black community in Montgomery, Alabama, stops riding the buses. There's a lot of peaceful marches that he does in Birmingham. I'm going to show you some of the photos from there down the road. You may have seen some before, but that's where there was a very racist sheriff that comes in and he's using fire hoses and police attack dogs. And basically the whole protest was peaceful. It was black people marching in the streets of Birmingham, but they're getting assaulted and beaten up and bullied by local law enforcement. So that definitely made the using those peaceful protest tactics makes the police come across as the bad guys, the aggressors. The March on Washington, that's where he gives his I Have a Dream speech. Most of you probably have heard that or seen some images from it. And then probably the biggest of all of them is the Selma March. I'll probably be showing you some clips from a movie that was called Selma, showing you a little bit of that down the road. But that's the one that's going to lead to the Voting Rights Act, which basically gives black people equal voting rights with white people, because there were a lot of discriminatory laws in the southern states that would kind of prohibit them from being able to go vote, be politically active. Now, we haven't gotten into the Vietnam War yet, but I do want you to know Martin Luther King was very, very opposed to the Vietnam War. As we start covering that, which we're probably in a few weeks, a month out or so, but I'm going to tie Martin Luther King into that unit too, into the big picture of what was going on in the Vietnam War. And then to end up his story, I want you to know he ended up getting assassinated in 1968. Very racist white dude. And there's actually some conspiracy theories there where some people, there's no ironclad evidence of this, but some people speculate that like the CIA or the US government was behind it, because he had been illegally wiretapped by the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover thought he was like a communist. So Martin Luther King comes under a lot of scrutiny and heat because he was such a big leader. And there were a lot of people in the government that were not happy really with what he was doing. Even though he was peaceful, a lot of people didn't like that he was really like stirring the pot and making changes. Generally, most historians would say that the civil rights movement ends when he is assassinated. And then a few months later, Bobby Kennedy, who was also he's a white guy, President Kennedy's brother, but he was very supportive of the civil rights movement too. The two of these guys get assassinated by separate people a few months apart, and that kind of takes the steam out of the movement, and it kind of dies out for a little while. So anyway, there you go for Martin Luther King. Next up on the list, I have Malcolm X. Now, I think in many ways, let me move my picture a little bit here. Martin Luther King, in my opinion, was more successful. He was able to achieve more. He was able to appeal to a much broader audience and swath of the American public. Malcolm X, though, in my opinion, is more interesting. And I totally get his appeal. Even though I may disagree with him on quite a few of his strategies and tactics, boy, he's a very interesting guy, and I'd highly encourage you to learn more about him after you finish up these notes here. There was an excellent movie. It was called Malcolm X, where Denzel Washington plays him. Check it out. He also wrote an autobiography, which the movie is kind of based on that. Anyway, really, really interesting story, and his story is far different from what Martin Luther King's is. So let me move my face here again. Sorry for this. All right, here we go. So, Malcolm X, what I'd want you to know about him, very different childhood. He is orphaned as a child. Now, his dad was a black Christian preacher, and he was very outspoken. He was not like a shy, reserved guy, and he spoke out against like racial injustices and whatnot. Anyway, in many places around the country, that was not a popular message, and that put a lot of heat and flack on him. Their house actually was vandalized when he was out. I think it was in Omaha, Nebraska, which was where Malcolm was born. They were terrorized. His dad would have to leave town sometimes, and his mom was there. And it was a big family. I think he had there was like 6 children in the family. Malcolm was somewhere in the middle there, terrorized. Eventually, they end up leaving and they come to Lansing, Michigan. So he moves to Michigan, to our state, really nearby us, and he continues to be a preacher and is very outspoken about like racial issues. Well, that attracts the attention of the local KKK chapter, which, you know, the KKK is not a real big force in America today, but back in the 1950s and 60s, it totally was. And this is actually even a little before that. When he was a kid, I want to say we're in roughly like the 1930s or 40s or so. Anyway, his dad is outspoken and ends up getting murdered by the Klan. He had an insurance policy to take care of his family if that ever happened, because he knew what he was doing was kind of playing with fire and dangerous. Anyway, the police and the insurance company rule it that it was a suicide, but his skull was bashed in with a hammer and he was left on railroad tracks and run over by a train. Does that sound like a way anybody you ever heard of is committed suicide? I don't think so. Anyway, they're not able to get the money from the insurance company, so the family kind of descends into poverty, and the mom is stressed out and can't take care of all these kids, can't pay the bills, and she essentially loses her mind and basically goes insane, ends up dying in an asylum. That puts all of the kids, Malcolm and his name originally at that time was Malcolm Little. It puts them all into foster care. He basically goes through school. I think it was in Mason, Michigan. Had a pretty rough experience. Doesn't see any of his brothers or sisters anymore. Bounces around to different foster families. Is in an orphanage. He ends up taking a wrong turn in life for kind of obvious reasons here, and ends up falling in with criminals. Becomes a thief, a drug addict. Pretty rotten character in his younger life. Like he describes it that way himself in his book, that he was just doing all the things wrong and had no discipline, was just kind of a rotten scumbag when he was growing up. And through those kind of late teens, early 20s years, he ends up getting convicted of robbing a rich white person, but he was also dating a white girl at the time. So he said that, you know, he gets put in prison for that, and the official charge was armed robbery, but he said his real crime was that he was having sex or dating a white woman, which I think that made it far worse. He probably was going to get locked up for the robbery anyway, but then the judge, knowing that, really threw the book at him. Well, going to prison actually turned out to be kind of a blessing in disguise. His life totally changes in prison because he goes in kind of a thug and a thief and pretty uneducated. When he's in prison, key part of his story, he was not religious at all, really, at this time. Even though his dad had been a preacher, he fell away from religion totally. In prison, he converts to Islam. He becomes a very, very devout Muslim. And I would say he's a true believer, 100%. He starts listening to the preachings of this guy who is the head of the Nation of Islam in America, called Elijah Muhammad. He prays every day. He starts reading. He becomes disciplined. And here's the thing. He's very charismatic and a great public speaker, okay? Well, when he ends up getting out of prison, Elijah Muhammad, he's been writing letters back and forth to him. And Elijah Muhammad realizes, hey, this guy has some untapped potential here. And basically, over a couple year period, he becomes like, he's not running the Nation of Islam. He's not the top Muslim like in America, but he is the face of the Nation of Islam. And he is by far the best speaker that they have like in their organization. He goes and basically his message is that Christianity is a white man's religion that's been used as a tool of oppression. He says, you know, what was his last name? His last name on his birth certificate was Malcolm Little. All right. Where did he get that last name from? I've heard him explain this before, actually, in an old interview, and he's pretty articulate in doing it. That, you know, if you go back to his great grandfather that was brought over as a slave, who knows what his actual African last name was, but some white Southern planter bought him as property and changed his last name to whatever the planter's last name was, and that's how, like, essentially most Black people of slave descent, that's where their last names typically come from. So his message was that, hey, I don't know what my true last name was. That was the slave name that was given to me, Malcolm Little. So when after he comes out of prison and converts to Islam, he legally changes his last name to X, which X in mathematics is a variable. It's the unknown. So he uses X as his last name to say, I don't know what my last name is, and until I ever find it, I'm going to keep X, which means it's an unknown variable. He doesn't know his true last name. I get it. That makes sense to me, and I kind of respect that decision and understand where he's coming from there. He says that Christianity is a religion that's designed to oppress Black people, and that Black people should not be Christians, which that's a white man's religion, that you should convert if you're a Black person to Islam, which that's a religion for people of color. That's his message. He's able now, still the vast majority of Blacks in America at this time would have been associated with Christianity. That was their religion. But he is able to convert a big amount, a large amount of young Blacks and older Black people too, to Islam and win them over to his religion. Now, the Nation of Islam is a pretty militant group where Martin Luther King would say, protests have to be peaceful, and no matter what, we're not going to get violent. It's civil disobedience. Malcolm X would never say that. He actually was very critical of Martin Luther King and said, you're an idiot. Why would you do that? Why would you tell somebody to not stand up for themselves? His message, and I'm probably butchering his quotes a little bit here, but essentially the essence of his message was that I'll be nonviolent with people that are nonviolent with me. So he doesn't ever say go out and start a riot or fight or have, he never endorses violence, but he also won't condemn it. And he's like, if you're going to do mean things to me, if you're going to do terrible things to my family, I'm going to come back at you. You get what you give is kind of his message. He encourages Black people to join rifle clubs and get guns. Lots of different feisty quotes like that. And I can totally see his appeal because he's all about Black people standing up together. Where Martin Luther King wanted to be inclusive and win as many white people over to his cause and come out and support, Malcolm X didn't want that at all. He said, we can't have any Black and white unity until we first have Black unity. And he's like, we won't have Black unity until all the Blacks stand up with courage and they convert to Islam. And then, and another thing, like, Martin Luther King wanted to end segregation. He wanted, in the I Have a Dream speech, he says, I dream of a day where men will be judged by the content of their character rather than color of their skin. The integration that will combine together the races and judge people based on character. Malcolm X, he said the only thing he liked segregated was his coffee. Putting cream and the coffee in with some cream and stuff and mixing it up, that he wanted segregation. He didn't think Blacks and whites should mix together. He actually wanted a policy he advocated for that was never going to happen or seriously considered, was to break away a chunk of the United States and essentially make a Black America where all the Black people in the country would move to this little chunk of states or the territory, and the white people are out, and you have two separate Americas where we don't mix them. Now, practically, that was never going to happen, but you can get an idea like how radically different his message is to compared to Martin Luther King. It was very militant and like kind of a roundabout way would kind of encourage violence, but he was also all about discipline too. He never once actually said go out and cause violence, but he said defend yourself. Okay. Now over time, he ends up finding out that Elijah Muhammad was not what he thought he was, and becomes very disillusioned. Finds out that Elijah Muhammad, this guy that he had looked up to, that was the head of the Nation of Islam, had basically not been practicing what he was preaching, because in Islam, it's supposed to be a man and a wife, and that's it. And they don't believe in sex outside of marriage. Well, Elijah Muhammad had fathered a bunch of kids and had been sleeping around with a lot of young Muslim girls in the nation. Malcolm X is totally disillusioned, because Malcolm X, I think, I'll give him credit for this. I think he was a true believer and he actually practiced what he preached. But many of the others in the Nation of Islam were not like that. So he ends up breaking away and starting his own separate organization of Muslims, and starts his own mosque, which is like a Muslim church in New York City. He also does a pilgrimage. I had it on the last slide, where he goes to Egypt, and then he eventually does the pilgrimage from Mecca to Medina, which all Muslims are supposed to do once in their life. While he is over there and he experiences that, he ends up meeting Muslims of all different colors. He meets white people with blonde hair and blue eyes that are Muslims, and it changes his perspective. And in the last few years of his life, his message really, really changes a lot, where he ends up saying, I think I judge some people wrong. I still want Black unity. I still want Black people to become Muslims, but he tones things down quite a bit, and he mellows a little bit towards the end of his life. Now, his problem was he ends up getting assassinated, just like Martin Luther King. Actually, a few years before Martin Luther King. So maybe I did these out of order. But he does not get assassinated by a racist white Southerner. He actually gets assassinated by a crew of other Black Muslims. The Nation of Islam was really, really upset when he broke away and started his own separate mosque. They didn't like that. He was their number one spokesman, and now he's pulling followers away from him. So he actually gets targeted and killed by other Black Muslims. So kind of a rotten thing there. Sad end to both of these guys' stories. But I wanted to give you that contrast in leadership styles. I think both of them are remarkable men that had a huge impact on America. Now think, who would appeal to you more? And I think a lot of that is, who are you as a person? So for the Q&A today, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of, say you had been a young Black teenager back in the 1960s. Which of these guys would have appealed to you more and spoke to you? Your experience in America would be way different if you were Black in that era versus being a white person in that era. Now, also remember, whites are almost 80% of the population or so. If you had just been an average middle-aged white person in America, not saying you're racist or even from the South, you're just, say, a farmer in Michigan or something, which of these two guys would have maybe you been more open to and appealed to you more? And then think, from today, being yourself, just learning about him in history, which of these guys appeals to you more? Which one do you think had more impact and had the right strategy and take? So hopefully you enjoyed these notes. I really like talking about these guys. If you have any questions, hit me up. I'd love to go into more detail with any of you, but I don't want to drag it on too long. So check out, these guys have both had some really good movies made about them. I would highly recommend Selma for Martin Luther King, and I'd highly recommend the movie Malcolm X. It's all about Malcolm X's life story, if you're interested in him. Take care. Have a good one.